I was just telling Dan last week that podium, comes up and down, and one of these days we're going to remove the podium, and I thought that you guys would just go ahead with the song and the prayer, and I would just ascend out, at my time, but I see that's not going to work, so we'll abandon that idea. We're talking about the God of all things, and we've been looking at different images, different really material things that God has created, that God has used to communicate to us in one way or another. And this morning what we're going to do as we start is just start in Psalm 131. Now this is not, you might want to turn there, it'll be on the screen as well, at least at times, but this is not a psalm that is dealing with our particular created thing just yet, but it is a psalm that is going to help orient us around the takeaway or the content for today's class. Psalm 131, and starting in verse 1. This is a very long psalm, by the way. If you've turned there in your Bible, you know what I mean. Psalm 131, verse 1, and we'll just look at verse 1 for a second. O Lord, my heart is not lifted up, my eyes are not raised too high. I do not occupy myself with things too great and too marvelous for me. What do you think David means in saying that there are things too great and too marvelous for him to occupy himself with? Things too great and too marvelous for me. Yeah, I think marvelous is being used in this sense, not of like wonderful and delightful, but like as in big and difficult. Yeah, like just imposing maybe. Exactly. Things too beyond me. But I guess what I'm really asking is, he's saying there are things that lie beyond the realm of his comprehension, but like what? What are things too great and too marvelous for him that he's having to say, I will not occupy my mind with these things? Okay.
Trying to figure out how God works.
Okay, the way God works specifically, yeah.
Just trying to figure out God. Or just trust Him. Just saying, well, I can't figure all that out, and I'll just trust you.
Yeah.
I guess I think more literal, even just, I picture him staring at the heavens, the creation, stars, just all the things around him.
Yeah, so when I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking about it from two senses, I guess. On the one hand, there are some things that lie beyond our collective understanding, right, as human beings. Like, there is no way that we collectively, putting all of our power and money and mental mind power together, are going to be able to predict the future, right? That the future fortune telling is something that lies beyond our capacity as a whole human race. As a specific subset of that, and this is what I think several were hinting at, there's this idea that we're never going to be able to fully understand the way that God works in history. I mean, we can see, Joseph's story. Joseph can look back and say, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. But that kind of perception is really not possible for us looking forward. It's possible for us looking backwards to see at least something of how God has been at work, but we really can't comprehend exactly how God's sovereign reign works, especially as it pertains to even things like human free will, and there's all kinds of debate and questions about that in Christian theology, but it lies beyond our ability to conceive what does it mean for a God who is not bound by space, matter, or time, an eternal being who is all-powerful, all-knowing, all of that. We can't really get our mind around what does that look like for him to work in the world. So that's difficult. Yeah, Raymond.
God's so complicated, we only know touch what he does for us.
Yeah.
It's impossible because we don't have the mental capacity.
Just the greatness and complexity of God. My ways are not your ways. My thoughts are not your thoughts. That idea. That's good.
I heard somebody, I think it was Thursday afternoon, trying to explain the elementary view of AI.
Uh-huh.
And when you said that collectivity of
Yeah.
all, and that's what it's about, is taking information that all humans can, know and put it all together in one big bundle. But even with that, it doesn't make, you still will never get close.
Right.
To the real picture.
Yeah, but it's a good point because, and that's really what I'm illustrating here is there is an added level of depth that we can go when we all work together, and we have specialists. You go to the doctor and you want to see somebody that has focused all of their life just on this one particular spot on the human body, right? Because we realize that if we have a bunch of doctors that are all specialists on unique aspects of the human body, then we're going to find more knowledge that way. But when it comes to God, we also think about what about the return of Christ? Just about every year, somebody is out there saying, we crunch the numbers again, and it's happening next week, or something like that. This is something beyond our ability to determine the totality of God's plan, all of these things. But then, and here's maybe where it gets a lot more personal, there are also things that lie outside my personal understanding or ability to understand. Some of those things will be specific to me. For instance, we talked about that doctor who specializes in the neck or whatever. That's beyond my ability to understand, right? I'm not a doctor. I have not studied the neck, so I have no idea. But then there are also things that are beyond our grasp personally, but it would be true for each of us. So let's think about it. It's beyond my understanding to contemplate other people's opinions of me, isn't it? It's impossible for me to live my life in a perpetual state of questioning. I wonder what that person thinks about. I bet what that person is thinking is ... It lies beyond my ability to understand the outcome. It lies beyond our ability to understand the outcome of our children's lives, like what their future is going to look like. It is beyond our personal understanding to think about what your career or my career is going to look like. It lies beyond our personal understanding. Whenever we get into thinking about what's going to happen in some sense or another, or what is happening in the mind of other people, we're contemplating things that are beyond our ability to actually know and to understand. And then to take that a step further for David, I think there is this element of how do you rule a nation well? That's a question that we've been fighting wars about since the dawn of time, right? How do you rule well? Solomon, when he was, he had his experience with God, what was Solomon saying? I need wisdom. I need help to know how to lead these people. I don't know how to do this. There are things too great and too marvelous for us to, or too big for us to fully iron out. It doesn't mean that we cannot put our thoughts toward some of these things, at least in part, but to be occupied with finding the perfect solution for every single question and problem that we face is going to be problematic. There are things that are not, let me put it this way. Some mysteries are too high for all of us. There's no way to understand God's sovereignty perfectly. But then some burdens are simply too heavy for me to carry. Some mysteries are too high to understand, and some burdens are too heavy for me to take on to try to understand. In other words, I cannot, no matter how much I might like to, I cannot be the human being that solves world hunger, cures cancer, figures out how to, take care of the perfect policy for immigration, you just go through all of the list of needs that we might have as a society and as a globe. There are some mysteries too high for us. There's also some burdens that are simply too heavy for us, and we see both of those both those aspects of grappling with occupying ourselves with things beyond our ability playing out in Scripture. For instance, in Job 42, we get this idea of contemplating beyond our ability to understand. I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. You know that God in Job eventually answers Job from the whirlwind and really blows Job away with his teaching to Job, asking Job, listen, you've tried to tell me exactly how I ought to do what I do, but where were you? Where were you when I set the foundation of the earth? Where were you when I created the atmosphere, when I crafted this animal and that animal? Where were you? Answer me, he says, if you have this kind of understanding. And Job eventually is going to say, I spoke about things that I couldn't grasp, things beyond my reach. But then I also think about this passage in Luke 10. This is a familiar passage, I think, about Mary and Martha. And Martha's problem in this passage is not that she is being occupied with things beyond her ability to understand, but she's being occupied with burdens that are really not needed to be carried in this moment. There's something better for her, but she's occupied with something else. Now, as they went on their way, Jesus entered a village, and a woman named Martha welcomed him into her house. And she had a sister called Mary who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to his teaching, but Martha was distracted with much serving, occupied, you could say. And she went up to him and said, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve all alone? Tell her then to help me. But the Lord answered her, Martha, Martha, you are anxious and troubled about many things, but one thing is necessary. Mary has chosen the good portion, which will not be taken away from her. We could say that Martha was occupied with too much, not that the things were beyond her comprehension as much as they were beyond her need in that moment. I think we can all relate to that, at least in some sense. Mary, I think you actually gave me this book a couple of years ago to borrow, and I need to return it to you. But you know this book? Mary's like, yeah, I've been looking for that. But how many of you know this book? Raise your hand if you know this book. I keep trying to use these kids' stories as illustrations, and you guys don't know them, okay? I'm going to have to do get the rocking chair right here, and I'm just going to read you a few of these, okay? This book has been around for 50 years or more, so none of y'all have an excuse, right? Let's just saying that. Okay, so it's been around for 50 years. This is a story of a caterpillar who is trying to find meaning and purpose in the world. And this is not exactly a kid's book. I mean, it is, but it also isn't. He comes upon, I'm not going to tell you the whole story, but he comes upon this giant pillar going up into the sky, and it's actually a pillar of caterpillars. They're all climbing on top of each other. This giant pillar column. They're all climbing on top of each other, trying to get up as high as they can into the sky, higher and higher. To see what or to experience what, none of them knew. They're just climbing up because everyone else is climbing. So they said, we got to climb. This is what we do. There's something up there. If we could just get up there, then we're gonna get that experience that we are longing for and craving. And they climb and they climb and they push and they shove and they crush and they kill even to get to the top. The book doesn't use the word kill, but that's the idea. And I think that this lady, the author, is she's trying to illustrate in this little story much of our society. We climb and we climb and we climb and we climb and we climb. But the question is, what are we trying to get at the top? And there's a point in the book when one of the caterpillars even asks, he said, what are we going up here for? And he finally gets up to the top, and one of the caterpillars says, there's nothing up here. And the other one says, we're the ones that are up here, and they're not up here. That's what's up here. Like, because we're on top. Why would you want to go back down? We made it, you know. And made it to what? And at what cost? We pushed and shoved and sent caterpillars flying off the pile. And at one point in the story, the caterpillar looks out and he sees that this one pillar is just one of many columns and pillars of caterpillars all over as far as the eye can see. There's these pillars and pillars and pillars of caterpillars climbing and climbing and crushing on their way to what? We are occupied and concerned with many things. And in that occupation, struggle to find the thing that is needed. So the question the psalm, I think, invites us to consider is, how do we respond to that? How do we respond to that? Well, verse 1 is already a clue. I mean, David's saying what we ought to say, but in the next verse, he says this, but I have calmed and quieted my soul. Like a weaned child with its mother, like a weaned child is my soul within me. This is from the ESV, I think, and weaned child is probably better described as like a 3-year-old or 4-year-old child is my soul within me, maybe 2, but the idea is like a young child. Lord, I don't think too highly. I don't raise up my eyes to consider things beyond my comprehension, he says in verse 1. I don't occupy myself with things too great and too marvelous for me, but I have quieted my soul like a weaned child with its mother, like a little kid with its mom. That's how my soul is within me. I want you to look at this picture for a second. I don't know how old that kid is, but I Googled son and mom, you know. But what is that child feeling in this picture? I mean, safety, comfort, love, content. What else? Security, trust, warmth, peace. This is what David describes his own state as being. Like a small son with his mother. That's how my soul is within me. O Israel, hope in the Lord from this time forth and forevermore. In other words, find in the Lord, he's saying, That embrace that quiets the soul, the presence of the one who knows what you do not know, right? That's also what's happening here. There's somebody that knows more than I know, who can carry what I can't carry, who cares even more than I care about myself. O Israel, hope in the Lord from this time forth and forevermore. One way that we might feel the embrace of God in our life is to go back again to the Sermon on the Mount. We're actually going to probably look at Luke, but Sermon on the Plain. And to go back to Jesus' teaching to the people when he uses this expression, consider the lilies of the field. Luke 12, 22 through 34. We'll read this at length. If you want to turn there, you're welcome to. Luke 12, starting in verse 22. And he said to his disciples, "Therefore I tell you, do not be anxious about your life, what you will eat, nor about your body, what you will put on. For life is more than food, and the body more than clothing. Consider the ravens. They neither sow nor reap." We could have had a whole one on the ravens too, but that anyway. "Consider the ravens. They neither sow nor reap. They have neither storehouse nor barn, and yet God feeds them. Of how much more value are you than birds? And which of you, by being anxious, can add a single hour to his span of life? If then you are not able to do as small a thing as that, why are you anxious about the rest? Consider the lilies, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin. Yet I tell you, even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. But if God so clothes the grass, which is alive in the field today and tomorrow is thrown into the oven, how much more will he clothe you, O you of little faith?" I'm sorry, I didn't click yours ahead. "And do not seek what you are to eat and what you are to drink, nor be worried, for all the nations of the world seek after these things, and your Father knows that you need them. Instead, seek his kingdom, and these things will be added to you. Fear not, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom." By the way, that sentence is one of the few variations between Jesus' teaching in Matthew and Luke in this same section. "Fear not, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give to the needy. Provide yourselves with money bags that do not grow old, with a treasure in the heavens that does not fail, where no thief approaches and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Consider the lilies of the field," he says. I want to ask you today the question, and by the way, we're going to look at a few different kinds of flowers. I know basically nothing about flowers, so feel free to correct me, but I think that's a lily, right? That's my knowledge of flowers, all right? What can we learn from the lilies? What is Jesus using the lily to illustrate in our passage?
Resilient.
What? I'm sorry?
Resilient.
Resilient? Yeah.
The beauty and how spacious they could look to us, and they had nothing to do with it. It was God and his, plan for them to look that way. They're not concerned about how they look.
Yeah, they just are what they are, right? Because that's who God made them to be, what God made them.
Talk about don't be worried about things that we just do so much, and he wants to do a bunch for us that we won't allow him to.
Yeah.
Those lilies allow him to.
Yeah. I wonder if that word, when Jesus says consider, I wonder, it's certainly in my life, I haven't spent a lot of time considering the flowers in the field, right? But Jesus calls them to consider the lily, to take some time to think about this flower that God created. What else is it about the lily that Jesus wants us to see in this passage in Luke?
They die every year, they go back to a mold, which
Yeah. There's a cycle, right, that takes place for these flowers, and as you said, they have the ability to multiply and to grow again, and everything is provided for, right? I mean, that's at the heart of it. Everything is provided that is needed for these plants. But Jesus emphasizes beyond their beyond the logical, rational side of, hey, it's an amazing plant that, the way the pollen works and they regrow and, all of those kinds of things. But he also says, consider that Solomon in all his splendor was not clothed like the lily is clothed. Now, the question I would ask is, do we believe that? I mean, look at the lily here, right? I could have brought one. I should have brought one. That would involve me knowing what one is, right? But But do I believe that is clothed better than anything Solomon ever wore? That Solomon's beauty, with all of his presumably billions of dollars of wealth, that flower right there is clothed even more beautifully than he ever could be. Do I believe that? That's a harder question, I think, isn't it? I mean, really, when you actually stop to consider the lily, to say, boy, what lily of the field, what could I buy with $20 billion, And he says, I want you to think that there's nothing that Solomon could acquire that could match the lily in beauty. I'm not saying that Jesus isn't speaking hyperbolically. I mean, he's trying to make a point, but the point is that maybe Jesus saw the lily as being more beautiful than I do. The lily, he says, they don't toil or spin, and yet they have this kind of beauty. And Jesus asks, are you not of much more value than they? Perhaps the lilies, part of the lesson of the lilies is to understand that beauty is given rather than earned. Beauty is given rather than earned. That, in other words, the lily is not what it does. The lily is beautiful because of what it is, what God made it to be. And in the same way, human beings are valuable not because of what we do, but because of what we are, as created by God in His image. And Jesus, I think, calls us back in considering the lilies. He calls us back to the same thing that David is calling to his mind in Psalm 131. He's calling us to quiet our soul within us again, to take a break, to consider. You have to have a space to consider, right? You have to have time to step back from all that's going on in the world and to realize I am not the sum of my accomplishments. That is not what makes me beautiful, valuable. It's not what makes me anything worth, anyone worth, no, it doesn't make me somebody. Consider the lily of the field that didn't toil or spin and yet was clothed in more beauty than all of Solomon's treasures could buy. And consider that you are much more valuable than they. My guess is that I think there's probably someone here today that needs to hear that message. Probably somebody standing here, right? But that you are not what you do, that beauty value is given rather than earned in God's economy. But are there other things that we can learn from the flowers? Other things that we can learn from looking out at there's more than lilies out there, right, that God has created. I want to read you a few things from Andrew Wilson. He wrote a book that I've consulted in this study we've been doing. But this section that he has is not a teaching section. It's more him reflecting on some of these various flowers. And I thought it was worth stopping and thinking about. Anybody know what these flowers are? Okay, I think these are bluebells. I say that because that's what the computer said they were, but you know AI and everything, right? But for 11 months, you can just listen to this. I think this is said well, and I think there's something here that illustrates what Jesus is getting at and what David's getting at in Psalm 131. For 11 months of the year, they do nothing at all. They lie dormant in the woods, deep beneath the soil, hidden under an unglamorous canopy of fallen leaves and slowly rotting bracken. They are surrounded by trees which tower over them and get to experience light every day. But they aren't worried about that. They bide their time. They know that when May finally arrives, they will all come out to play together, forming an elaborate carpet of deep blue that will summon townsfolk from miles around just to amble among them and get their children to pose for photos. They are not perennials, and they know it. They don't try to be something they're not. They take the water and nutrients that God gives. They grow in obscurity for much of the year, and when the seasons turn and the sun comes out, they rejoice. Isn't that what Jesus is getting at when he's asking us to consider the lilies of the field? He's asking us to consider that the lily of the field doesn't try to be anything other than what it is. And what it is a lily. And what you are is a human being. And that's who God made you to be, to bear his image into the world and to realize that your value and worth comes from being his creature, not from being, powerful and smart and cunning and all of that in your own right. But he goes on and he talks about a couple others that I think, again, are worth hearing and considering. What are these? See, that one I feel pretty confident about, right? Yeah, roses. They are a byword for love. Even though dozens of flowers are at least as beautiful, he names a bunch of flowers. Dozens are at least as fragrant. So why do they make so many appearances on Valentine's Day or at weddings? Because for all sorts of poetic and historical reasons, they have come to embody romance. A bunch of roses says, "I love you," far more than a bunch of wild daisies, no matter how pretty the daisies might be. The true power of roses comes not from what they are in themselves, their pollen, their curvature of their petals, their color, but from what they represent. The meaning and value of the gift derives from the love of the giver. And if that is true of a rose, how much more is it true of a human being? Someone can give roses and it means nothing to someone else, right? Because there's no relational connection. Maybe the relationship is even fractured, and in the case of roses, obviously, usually the husband giving to the wife, but it could be, you could fill this in with all kinds of other things. But hey, we don't get along right now, but here's some flowers. The value of the gift of a rose comes not from the rose itself, but from what it represents, the love of the giver. And if that is true of a rose, how much more is it true of a human being? That you and I are valuable because God made us and because God chose to love us. Chose to love us. love us not as an artist loves their painting, or as an engineer or architect loves their building, but love us as a father loves his child. He chose to make us and to love us. And at the end of the day, our security and our sense of purpose and meaning comes, again, not in our laboring and toiling and spinning, as Jesus says, of the lily, but in the fact that we are known and loved by the very Creator God as His own children. I think these are sweet pea flowers, maybe. They don't aspire to be more than they are. They don't look over their shoulder at the sunflowers and wonder why they aren't taller or brighter and yellower or more capable of being made into oil or allowed to live in the south of France or made with large black faces and strong stalks. They don't see their value in relative terms at all. They have been given delicate textures and gently blended purple and white petals, and they wear them with pride. They're much happier that way. These are, that's a jade vine. This is kind of being told from Jesus' perspective. Some might think it an unsuccessful species. You might have never heard of it because it lives only in the rainforests of the Philippines. And it's almost impossible to grow anywhere else because it's pollinated mainly by bats. Bats! By most worldly metrics, it loses out to every other flower you can think of, but I love it. I delight in its minty green color and its hanging clusters of claw-like flowers. I love that the blooms look like butterflies and their wings folded, and that for all its floral beauty, it is actually a bean. And I love that it carries on, flowering in oddness and obscurity, unnoticed and unheralded, and doesn't care whether anyone has heard of it, content simply to be known and loved by me. Haven't I chosen the foolish things in the world to shame the wise? This is the last one. But you see here that what Wilson was trying to do in writing these little pieces of reflection on these flowers, this could be said for all the flowers, but I think he's calling us, and I think this goes to what Jesus and the psalmist are calling. Look at what God has made, you know. God could have just made one lily, right? But he's chosen to provide us all of this beauty, and he's saying that there's nothing that we can do that matches what God can create and God can make. Here is the lowly dandelion, you know. We're trying to kill these things normally, but it's hard to think of anything more fragile than a blowball. If any species has a right to be anxious, it would be a pale ball of fluff that can be blown to smithereens by a small child, carried by the wind, scattered over a wide area. But then it takes root and becomes one of the most robust flowers anywhere, almost impossible to pull up with your bare hands, so much so that many exasperated gardeners call it a weed, and the French call it lion's tooth. Do you see? By the way, in French, it's like, I don't know French. I'll give you the American French, dent de lion, lion maybe, right? But you can see dandelion, lion's tooth. Do you see? Its weakness is its strength. By giving itself up to be blown away, it rises indestructible and brings forth much fruit. If God so resurrects the dandelion, which is here today and gone tomorrow, will He not much more resurrect you, O you of little faith? And He said to His disciples, therefore I tell you, do not be anxious about your life, what you will eat, nor about your body, what you will put on, for life is more than food, and the body more than clothing. Consider the ravens, they neither sow nor reap, they have neither storehouse nor barn, and yet God feeds them. Of how much more value are you than birds? And which of you, by being anxious, can add a single hour to his span of life? Look at this statement that he makes here at the end. If then you are not able to do as small a thing as that, why are you anxious about the rest? You cannot add 1 hour to your life. And Jesus says, if you could, it would be a small thing. 1 hour. So why are ye anxious about the rest? Consider the lilies, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin, yet I tell you, even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. But if God so clothes the grass which is alive in the field today, and tomorrow is thrown into the oven, how much more will he clothe you, O you of little faith? I wonder this morning if we would do well to pause in our routine and our day, our week, and to find us a flower somewhere growing and to say, let me consider this creation of God for a moment, and let me not worry. O Lord, my heart is not lifted up. My eyes are not raised too high. I do not occupy myself with things too great and too marvelous for me. But I have calmed and quieted my soul. Like a weaned child with its mother, like a weaned child is my soul within me. O Israel, hope in the Lord from this time forth and forevermore. Let's pray. Lord, as we close our class this morning, I pray that you would still our spirit, that you would calm and quiet our soul, that we would, in our many quests for progress and success and knowledge and understanding, that we would also have the patience and perspective to set all that aside and to simply contemplate a humble flower, and to realize that if you care so much for making beautiful a little plant, that you care all the more for those that you have created to be your image, for those that you have chosen to love. May we rest in that love, that grace, that value, that purpose as we go forth from here today. In Jesus' name, amen.